Well, I am Erin Chapin. I am the Director of Research Communications for the Office of Research and Engagement at UT Knoxville.
And I am David Goddard. I'm Senior Media Relations, I almost said correspondent, coordinator for the Tickle College of Engineering here at UT Knoxville.
So we're gonna briefly talk about, well, I hope briefly, talk about the difference between science writing and technical writing. Let me pull up our presentation and back it up to the beginning. Sorry, folks. All right. It shouldn't be this difficult. We'll see. All right. Here we go. So Dave and I, on a regular basis, our day-to-day job is trying to get across to our audience, our myriad audiences, about the work, specifically science and research, that happens here at the University of Tennessee. I've been here about 7 years, almost 7 years. And Dave, how long has it been for you?
It was 7 years in February, so about 7.5 now.
And Dave and I used to work together at the News Sentinel. So we're both coming from a common background. Dave started off in sports, and I started off in the online department. But we were both, responsible for a lot of the same type of content.
And I actually wound up in the online department for the last couple of years. So
yeah, we poached him. And then Dave brought me here. Well, Dave encouraged me to come to UT. That's a bunch of background information that you probably don't need. So let's jump right in. I love this quote because it really sums up what we do, what science communicators here on campus do. And we try to get this across to our faculty as well. And I'll just go ahead and preface this, that from a university standpoint, we in the Office of Research refer to research, scholarship, and creative activities to really kind of encompass all fields of study, because we have a lot of different types of sponsored scholarship and research. So to be successful in the role of communicator or science communicator, your audience or faculty have to know you exist. If you don't kind of get the word out that you are here to kind of help them and facilitate bringing their work to a larger audience, then, I mean, they're not going to reach out to you or someone in your office necessarily. They'll just go ahead and publish where they usually do, which is to journals. You have to trust, or you have to get them to trust that you won't butcher their science, and as they assume their reputation among their colleagues. You're here in a large part to just make sure to introduce their work to the general public and help faculty see the results of that. Now, I looked at, in preparing this, kind of the difference between technical writing and science writing. And you can think of it as the difference between truth and understanding. Not necessarily, those two terms aren't necessarily at either end of the spectrum. Both types of writing are truth. Both types of writing promote understanding in their audience, but there is like a tangible difference. I don't know if you all were aware, but there was a recent lunar eclipse. It happened to occur at the same time as a blood moon. And so lots of people were looking up specifics about lunar eclipses, when they happen, what exactly occurs during a lunar eclipse, and where you could see it. So there was an article on NASA's website, and NASA provides amazing information, and it really kind of spells out all of the details about a lunar eclipse or about a space launch, what have you. But if you look at the different descriptions of each parcel of information, you can tell it's really just the facts. There's no colorful information or colorful adjectives that come into play. It's really just the Earth moves between the sun and the moon. The Earth blocks the sunlight. It only occurs when the moon is full. And it gives you information about, like, okay, well, if you're in this part of the world, the best time to see it is at this time on this date. And it usually tells you or directs you to a page that has information on the schedule of eclipses. I pulled up actually information from the Farmer's Almanac, and the next annular eclipse of the sun will happen on June 10th, in case you're curious. So this was, and I found an article, like a different article on Medium, which is a fantastic site. They often publish sciencey or science-related articles. You can see there's a whole different type of language that they use. Pre-dawn sky, referring to the moon as our familiar planetary companion. That it's a delight for amateur astronomers. It even included some mythology and folklore around lunar eclipses. What different cultures thought they meant, and how different cultures to this day still see a lunar eclipse. So instead of saying, okay, if you want to see the lunar eclipse, you'll see a partial eclipse from this side of the world at X time, and you'll see a full eclipse over here. But on Medium, it talks about crawling out of bed, because I think in the only place viewable in the United States, you had to get up at like 3 a.m. to see something. Science writing tends to evoke an emotional response, interest, excitement, curiosity, and it makes the audience feel like a participant in the story. So why do we do what we do? What's the goal of science writing? Well, again, you want to engage your audience. You want to make sure that they understand the value of science and research. You foster trust in the scientific and academic community, as well as in the general public. It helps justify government spending on research and science. It helps educate your audiences, and it entertains, as you saw from the example that I used from the Medium. But you have to find a balance between explaining the science to your audience and the goal of engaging your audience in the story. There's a sweet spot where you're accurately explaining the research and its importance in a way that satisfies the faculty member who has put their time and effort and intellect into studying a particular field. And they're very they're very particular about how you refer to their work and the different terminology that they use. And it still has to make sense or make the topic interesting to a layperson. And that sweet spot is not always easy to find. So what's our process? Dave will go over this in more detail, but you have to decide who your audience is. Sometimes you have multiple audiences. You have to ask the right questions of your faculty member, write an engaging lead. And Dave, I tell people all the time, Dave Goddard is the king of an engaging lead. I often send people to him or show his writing samples to help people understand how exactly you need to pull people in, and be firm, but supportive of that faculty member. Make sure that again, you're finding that sweet spot without betraying their trust. So the audiences that we tend to write for are, the general public, John and Jane Q, what we refer to as our stakeholders. And it's a very broad term that can mean anything from community or corporate partners, fellow research collaborators at other universities, our legislators, so that they also understand the importance of this science and will open up that federal budget or state budget a little bit to fund the science. And administrators and the general campus community. We want to make sure that administrators, deans, and department heads, all the way up to the chancellor and the president, understand what's going on campus so they can share that information even more widely. And then, of course, media. Your print, digital, broadcast media. And that's, I think, where Dave and I, and our experience, as well as a lot of folks in communications and marketing here at the university, really shine. Since we used to work in those newsrooms, we understand to a large part how to pull those audiences in. What is it that's really going to trigger them to engage in the story, to open it, to read it all the way through, and to share it with their friends? Like, oh, hey, I read this really interesting article on knoxnews.com, or saw this really cool segment on WBIR and some of the other local stations. And let me tell you about it. It was really neat. So I'm going to scoot it on over to Dave and let him tell you a little bit more about what he does and how his process works.
And I'll start by saying that we are in two different locations and she is in control of the PowerPoint. So there may be moments where one of us gets ahead or behind of the other. Just bear with us.
I'm really going to try not to do that, Dave.
It's a different world. So let's start with everybody's favorite. If you're done with scientific reporting or writing at all, jargon is going to find its way into your ear at some point. And so I'd like to talk a little about what you do when it comes to town. And so jargon could be terminology that is very specific to a particular field, like cladding is to nuclear engineering, or hydrophobic is to chemical, or capacitance is to electrical. And that may mean a lot to them, but if you put that in a story for the general public, eyes are going to glaze over. And it could be unfamiliar measurements like degrees Kelvin or nanometers. Or it could be my favorite, what Erin and I like to call alphabet soup, which is people will rattle off agencies or research centers by their acronyms as though everyone knows what you're talking about. Like so-and-so got a DARPA grant. I was published in AAAS. Well, I know what that means now, but like Erin and I were talking about earlier, when I started and people would say, yeah, so-and-so got a $500,000 DARPA award, I'd shake my head like, oh, that's great. And I'd go back to my office and Google what in the world a DARPA award was. So you've got to assume that unless you're writing this for a very specific inside group, you got to assume it's the first time every reader is seeing these things. You got to spell it out. Even if it's something as well known as like Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we always spell it out on first reference, assuming that this may be the first time someone out there has seen this. And you want it to be as plain speak as you can, which takes us to sciencey versus plain speak.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I like to joke when people ask me what's the hardest part of my job, I say translating engineering into English.
Mhm.
And that is really a big chunk. And this is the perfect example that I always come back to. I was talking to a professor in material science who was talking about how one-dimensional objects interacted, which already that just blows my mind to think about. But his quote, I wrote this down directly, and his quote was, "We have gained a new understanding of heteroepitaxy, or using it to develop ideas about how one-dimensional boundaries interact." And so I paused him, and I was like, okay, what's another way of saying that? And he kind of struggled to come up with something. I said, well, how do you, help me visualize it? And he took his hands and he said, they form like this. And he just kept doing that. I said, oh, that looks like a zipper. And so what we came up with, instead of that first quote, was the boundaries of these materials interact like the teeth of a zipper, only on an atomic level. Now, 99% of us will never look at something at the atomic level, but everybody knows what a zipper looks like. So automatically, you've at least cut out 10% of people who might have otherwise gone glassy-eyed trying to read that. And so much of my job, I feel like, is coming up with these analogies to help turn one thing into something that everybody can understand. And so sometimes you get this. This is a current story that Erin and I are co-writing, I guess co-piloting at this point, that we have a versioning system where when you first start a story, it's version 0.1. And theoretically, 0.2 would be the first edit, and so on, until you get to version 1.0, which should be the clean version. This story as it stands is now on version 1.1, and that's still not the clean version yet. In other words, there have been 11 versions of this one 900-word story. So the key thing to keep in mind is to get it right. We are not breaking news. We're telling these research stories. In very rare cases, maybe you have a partner institution or a lab that really wants something out by a certain date. But most of the time, you can control when a story comes out. So don't rush it. Get it right. Tell it in a way that people can understand. And if it takes, 12 to 15 versions, so be it. This particular one is something that's going to be pretty big impact. So it's worth the time to get it right, even if it's semi-irritating on the front end. And so sometimes when you're telling a story, there might be a compelling reason for it to be sciencey, but there might be a compelling reason to hit the general public. And a good example for something we've done in the past, I call this a tale of two stories. And the picture you see is the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. I think this was actually North Texas. And you see the wall of dirt getting ready to come in and just clobber this farm. And so we had a professor who had done some breakthrough research on the Dust Bowl and its effects. And the science was enough that it was definitely worthy of being considered for journals, but it also had that socioeconomic impact and historical impact that the general public would be interested too. And so you don't want to have to write, two whole 500+ word stories. So what we did is we had two stories that were 90%, 95%, maybe even the same story, except when it came to the quotes and explaining the science. And so here are the two headlines, and I'll let you decide which one you think was the journal and which one you think was the public. New methodology yields evidence that Dust Bowl ravages lasted longer than thought. Or did Dust Bowl's ravages end in the 40s? New study says no. Now, clearly one of those is a journal and one isn't. So for the journal, this is a direct quote. This manuscript presents novel work that merges a watershed erosion model with an organic matter cycling model and builds new functionality, allowing simulation of the transport of light organic matter along a topographic gradient. The model is applied to 20th century changes in soil carbon across a farm hill slope and compared with recent soil carbon data. The chronosequence in SOC storage for the erosional zone revealed that conservation tillage and enhanced crop yields began in the 1980s, reversed the downward trend in SOC losses, Goddard is saying nearly 26% of the lost SOC to be regained. Obviously, that's the science version. The general public got this. We took a novel approach of merging a watershed erosion model with an organic matter cycling model to build a better understanding of how sediment and nutrients are transported differently depending on topography. It says the same thing. Average person, much more likely to read number 2 and understand it. But seriously, all we did was really change 1 or 2 quotes, and the rest of the story was the same. And this particular faculty member could not have been happier because it got ticked off the boxes for both the journal and the general public. And so, there's sciencey speak and there's plain speak, and you try to avoid it as much as you can because you want it to be as plain speak as possible, but you don't want it to be so dumbed down that the professor you send in your edits and the professor sends it back reinstating all the languages you just edited. I've seen that happen. I've had that happen. And so recently, I think about 3 weeks ago now, Inside Higher Ed, which the publication you all are probably familiar with, they had an article on scholarly articles. And the headline was, "New study says scholarly articles that are hard to read don't actually make the author sound smarter, and they get cited less." And there was this great quote from it. "Academics are like anyone else. The more effort we make them go through to understand what we're saying, the more likely they are to give up in frustration and look for a paper that's clearer." So you can make the argument to the researcher or the professor that you're covering that, yes, there's a time and place to keep it high-level science, but if you make it to the point that people have trouble comprehending it, or it gets boring, or they get lost and don't read it, then why are you writing it in the first place? And so one of the other things I wanted to talk about was engaging your audience, and Erin touched on this a little bit. You got to draw them in, and barring a breakthrough, let's say if I'm doing a story on fuel cells, there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of stories on fuel cells that are at least going to be somewhat similar. And so you got to differentiate yourself. So how do you make your story stand out from the crowd? And then for me, this is very much true. Headlines are your friend, but keep your audience in mind. So this is another recent example of it's the same story, different wording. This was a journal article in Nature, and the headline there was "Predicting Short-Range Order and Correlated Phenomena in Disordered Crystalline Materials." And so what you see here is a disordered crystalline material. But for plain speak person, it's going to be hard to make them grasp that. So what we went with for that was UT ORNL researchers make breakthrough in understanding atomic scale nature of disordered materials. And so the atomic scale nature of disordered materials, people aren't going to comprehend necessarily all that much anyway. But seeing the UT ORNL researchers make breakthrough is going to grab at least some more attention than you would have otherwise. It puts 2 of the biggest entities in the area out there, so people have something to have an entry point. And so, like on headline writing, it's be honest, but don't be afraid to have fun. And so, this movie, about 20 years or so ago, came out, and it dealt with small town, and I think it was coastal Canada. It was either Canada or New England. But anyway, so Billy is the editor, and he's got the reporter out in a boat. And there's an island in the distance that has one single gray cloud above it. So the editor says, "Tell me the headline." And the reporter says, "Horizon fills with dark clouds." And the editor says, "No, imminent storm threatens village." And so the reporter says, "But what if no storm comes?" And the editor says, "Village spared from deadly storm." So obviously this is far more fun than you should have with it, but don't be afraid to play around. Your job isn't just to tell the story, it's to sell your story so that people want to read it. It could be the best story in the world, but if you have a boring headline, nobody's going to click on it. And so some examples that we've had recently, these are all real examples that went in our alumni magazine, which goes to, I think, 30,000 people around the country. And so we had a professor, Jantz, that's working on computer memory. So we made the main headline, "Good memory, ha ha ha." Janet's changing the way computer programs use data. And then guy working on earthquakes, sense of stability, Horsham helping improve outcomes in earthquakes. And then we had a partnership with ORNL and Volkswagen that we titled Driven to Excellence. So just those little headlines on their own aren't going to draw you in, but they're more almost, I guess, relaxing to the reader than if we had just put like the subhead underneath them as the main headline. Those subheads are just so old school press releasey that they almost rub people the wrong way now. So you got to kind of, you don't want to put like, you'll never believe what these researchers are doing, but that kind of headline. Look at all the ways science can help you. But anyway, so there are times when it just needs to be straightforward though, because humor could just be bad taste or off-putting. And some of these examples are medical research, federal projects, defense spending. I mean, none of those, there's nothing funny about any of those. Anything related to safety or anything related to vulnerable parts of the population, like children or older adults. In those cases, don't try to be clever. Just tell the story straight up, or else you're not only not going to draw people in, you're probably going to make them angry. And so once you get them in, how do you keep them interested? Which is a big question. So getting them to read and click is big, but not if you lose them immediately. And I'm using this as an example to follow along. Science and technology can mean different things to different people. Even the definitions that an audience might give for each of these terms can vary by individual. If you can't quickly find a way to reach common ground when you begin your story, you risk alienating your audience. This is also true if you spend too much time trying to clarify a point. People will begin to lose interest in proportion to the amount of time it takes you to get to the heart of the story. As proof, I've purposely taken a long time to say this, meaning many of you have probably stopped following several slides ago and are instead looking at Smokey carrying the Power T flag. And the smiles tell me I'm right. So my point is, show why your story matters in an easy to understand way, but also as quickly as you can. Don't, so many things we'll get in for editing. The key to the story, you'll be reading through it, like this is a good story. And then the 8th paragraph will be like, oh, and the National Science Foundation gave them 10 million in funding. And you're like, no, that's way up top. Or, this could lead to endless energy. Why is this the 10th paragraph? Hit them with the important stuff and then explain away. So good stories start with good questions. And so obviously you need to ask questions to help guide the story. And anybody who's ever had any kind of journalism sort of class, get the basic W's, who, what, when, where, why. Now there's a couple of H's, how and how much. Those are particularly relevant in research. But where science writing can differ is that just by default, there are going to be times that you're having to use words that aren't normal everyday conversation words. And that doesn't necessarily even mean jargon, just, the language is what the language is. And so some of the things I've learned on those particularly hard to understand stories are what comes next and what does that mean for the public? Or put it bluntly, why should I care? Not that you'd say that to them, but why should I care? And so the example, this is David Mandris, who's one of our professors in material science. He's got all sorts of awards. He's one of the world's most cited researchers. He's got all sorts of fellowships. But spintronics, just to put it mildly or put it plainly, is the study of the spin of electrons and materials and using that to do things like magnetism or memory or energy even. But it's so in the weeds to explain. There's no, like going back to my earlier example, there's no atomic zipper to get people to understand the science. It's just really complicated. On the other hand, if you ask why does it matter, you can get people to understand why it's important even if they don't understand the science. And so in this case, for spintronics, you ask the question, why does it matter? And like the things I mentioned on, the stuff they are doing using the electrons in different ways, you could have 10-fold times of memory on your computer or your phone or your tablet, but at 1/10 of the power consumption. So you've got these super powered machines with super, just tons and tons of memory, that you maybe have to charge once a month. So people don't understand Ventronics, and no matter what you try to tell them, you're never going to get them to understand. But if you can go to them and say, your phone will have 10 times the memory, be 10 times as fast, and use a tenth of the power, they get it. And so sometimes you just have to talk about why does it matter to them? Why should they care? And one of the last things I'll touch on here is getting buy-in from staff and faculty, and how crucial it is and how successful you can be if you have it. So this is one of our governor's chairs, Tom Zawodzinski, and his focus is on fuel cells. And so, by this point, even if they don't necessarily understand them, a lot of people have heard the phrase fuel cell, or like rechargeable vehicles, things like that. Even if the inside terms might be, somewhat confusing, they at least are aware of the concept. And so he is world renowned. He's presented at conferences all over the place about fuel cells. But from my standpoint, he's also awesome because he gets what it is we're trying to do by now, after having worked with him enough, so that he comprehends, like, if something's for a journal, he knows to write it a certain way. And if he wants something that he thinks could be general public, he does it completely differently. He talks to us in a completely different way, because he understands through us working with him what it is we're trying to say. And so that in turn helps us tell his story to the public, which helps him, his profile. He gets invited to more conferences. He, chairs these committees. He's on fellowships of that. And I'm not saying he's that because of us, but I'm saying it helps his exposure and increases those chances. And it's because he, at some point, realized, okay, they're the communications office. They're not the scientific journal office. Like, he gets that we're talking to, my parents, for example, or people in the greater Knoxville area, or even like state legislators who might not understand how fuel cells work, but want to be able to go to Congress and be like, hey, our guy, Tom Zawodzinski has improved their efficiency by 50%. And now this car company wants to partner with him. Those things matter. And you can't get to that point if you keep it purely science. And so we have a few people like him. He's not the only one that understand not just what it is we're trying to do, but understand how to help us get there. So if you can cultivate these relationships over time, I can't tell you how beneficial it can be. And I think that leaves us question time. Anybody's got any?
That was great. Thank you all. I've got a question. I want to say, I love the slides. You guys, it's beautiful. Nice work on the slides. I don't know if that was you, Erin, doing that, or combo of you and David doing it together, but it's really lovely slides to look through. And you guys, team, yeah, and great storytelling. Like, I was engaged the whole way through, so no worries, David. I was right there with you the whole time. Great job.
This is where I would like to send a shout out to Central Media and their templating. Took a lot of those templates and put them to good use, even if we swatched out the pictures.
Yeah, that was great. You tell them they did excellent. Best ones I've seen so far. Beautiful
Thanks.
job.
Well, that's Ira's group.
Okay, yeah. I love David, your point about using the visuals with the zipper in the hands and kind of asking for that. I think that's brilliant. I wrote that down as like something to remember to do, like demonstrate to me visually what that might look like. That's a great thing to ask.
That particular one, that completely came about by luck, because I was in my first few months here, and I thought, oh man, is everything going to be this hard? And so, like, we had sat around for about 10 minutes and trying to explain, you take the R factor and blah, 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 whatever. And I'm just like staring at him like, I don't understand. So finally I said the thing about, do you have visuals? Thinking he would show me, maybe a graphic on his computer or something. He said, well, it's like this. I said, do that again. He said, they come together like that. I said, like a zipper. And he thought for a second. He said, yeah. And I was like, okay, I know how to approach this job now. Analogies are my friend.
Yeah, that was brilliant. That was brilliant on your part. Yeah, my question is kind of along those same lines. Like, is there some sort of visual tool? Like, I'm thinking not like an outline, but kind of like a model of, okay, this is how the story should flow, and this is how I can get them from here to here. Do you guys use anything like that, or have you used anything like that in the past? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I don't really have a set tool. It's almost not really a person by person as much as it is what the nature of the research is. Because I know going into it, for most things nuclear and a lot of computer science and material science, what exists will just be some schematic on a computer screen. So you have to figure out, okay, what's a better way to visualize this for people? And sometimes that also is just showing the outcome, like showing what it will do down the road.
And when I sit down with people, I usually start out by saying, like, this is just going to be a conversation. Just let's, and I always record because I'm horrible at taking notes really quickly. But I say, tell me about your science. I usually sneak in there, like, how did you become interested in this field? What was the process? And I was asking Dave, like, how long did it take for you in that conversation to get to the zipper? And Dave said, it's just a matter of coming back again and again and again and saying, I still don't get it. Can you
Explain it to me as though I'm a child.
And I've heard several people say, explain it to me like I'm in high school, and I guess they went to far more advanced high schools than I did in South Knoxville, because it usually is still really highbrow at that point in time. But I've heard people say, explain it to me like you would to your grandparents. Explain it to me like you would to a man on the street. Explain it to me, in very simple terms, or else our audience, our intended audience, will just not understand, and they won't, again, engage with that story.
And particularly this last 15, 18 months or whatever, because of the nature of us not just being able to walk into someone's office, most of the time, if I get wind of something, I'll say, is there an abstract you can send me? And so I'll have at least that to kind of prepare some questions from. And I said, one of my favorite topics of quarantine was getting, wind of some research thing, getting to a term I didn't understand, and Googling that term. And then in the definition of that term was another term I didn't understand, and then Googling that. And suddenly you've Googled like 8 different terms just to understand this one thing. But then, it also helps to tell the professor, hey, I tried to figure this out, but I'm still not totally sure. I think it means, this. And then they'll say, oh, no, what it really means is, but they at least know you've kind of tried. You're not just showing up, totally unprepared.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also important, and Tyra's office is really good at this. Tyra and Heather are really good at being able to show the results, where the story got picked up, maybe how many people have viewed it. And, once they see the reach of a particular story that we've written about them, they start to understand the value of working with us. They understand that not only will more people know about their science, about their research, it will elevate their reputation within their field. In the Office of Research, we look at publications and citations, like how many publications has this researcher, how many articles has this researcher sent to publications? How many of them have been published? How many researchers, other researchers, how often have they cited that particular article? Which means, those researchers, those other scientists are looking at their work and considering them an expert in their field. So it's important for us not only to get the meat of the story, not only to get it down to really understandable terms, but then to follow up and say, hey, this really took off. And, at the end of the year, or the end of a few years, actually, because it takes a little time to really build up on those citations, you come back and you say, oh, by the way, your article, your journal article was cited like 1,700 times.
And at the end of the day, and I mean this only in the positive way, I really do. Same way I found out a lot of stories is the same way I kind of get people to ease up sort of being maybe defensive about me changing their science speak into plain speak. And that's ego. Like there's no better thing to get, faculty member X in such and such department to talk to you than if their fellow faculty member in that department has had a story go viral. They will start to seek you out. Hey, I saw Professor so-and-so's story. Would you be interested in? So it's great to be able to say, yeah, actually, yeah, that made, Japan Times and News of Australia, and oh, cool. So you get buy-in. And again, I mean it nicely, but from ego, from people thinking, well, my stuff's good too. That's how you find out about stories, and that's how you get them more, I'm not going to say eager necessarily, but less defensive about you changing their work.
Yeah, I fall back on a tried and true tactic that I've been using since high school, maybe. I'm self-deprecating. And so I often say, gosh, I just don't quite get that. Maybe if you could break it down for me. I have a background in literature, so this is completely alien to me. Yeah, that sometimes works.
And also, I mean, just to make the point, put this out there, we don't send anything that they have not signed off on. Like if they get final approval, and if they're not happy with it, we'll keep tweaking it until they are, which is how you get the 11 versions of that one story. And that particular one, to be fair, it isn't just one person. There are like so many stakeholders involved in it, like multiple deans, multiple directors, multiple campuses. It's just like, okay, just tell us what to do next.
Does anybody else have?
Really? Oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, does anybody else have any questions? So it's perfect.
Oh, good. All right. Well, thank you, Erin and David. This has been really informative for us as well as people on our team. Do you have any resources that you would recommend? Some have expressed that, I haven't done a lot of science writing. I'd like to do a little bit more. Is there any book or favorite science writer or anybody that you would recommend that we take a look at just to kind of use as a reference and for inspiration?
The things I look at, typically some of the more popular ones are like Wired or Vox. I'm not going to spell it out. There's one that's IFL Science that is very much about putting it in plain speak, like as plain speak as could be, but I'll let you discover what the IFL stands for. The I is I and the L is love. You can fill in the F, but
there have been a handful of times that our researchers have made IFL Science, and man, you immediately see that just absolutely skyrocket, and it's awesome. Tyra, does that just kind of get picked up organically?
It depends, honestly. I mean, with content everywhere. So yes and no. But it's a great outlet.
I will say it is funny when one of those big sites pick it up. A lot of times, well, you're never the first to know. I don't know that you're necessarily the last, but like we had Chris Cherry is one of our professors. He really is one of the thought leaders for alternative transportation, talking like e-bikes, e-scooters, things like that. And I guess it's been a couple of years, but he had something picked up in Wired that like his entire department was abuzz about, he got in Wired. He's the lead story in Wired. And I found out like 3 days later, it's kind of, oh yeah, it was in Wired, right? And I was like, no, tell me these things. Like, but yeah, I mean, some of those are kind of ones that they take the science very seriously, but they also do a really good job of explaining it to the general public. They're not high end, in other words, they're like right down the middle. They respect the science, but they write it in such a way that everybody can understand, usually with graphics and charts and stuff.
One thing that I use as a research, and I just shared it in the chat, DOE has an absolutely incredible newsletter that they put out, I can't remember, once a week, a couple of times a month, that is all about science communications. I've shared this with communicators on campus several times. I think last year they created a page that explains terms, which I dive into all the time. It's a great resource. It also opens you up to a community of science writers across the country. So I highly suggest, unless you just are absolutely bombarded with these types of newsletters already, I highly suggest you subscribe, because it's just a wealth of information.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? I've got one more, and I'm sure I'm probably the only one here who doesn't know the answer to this, but I'm just curious, Erin and David, when you're writing your story, are you trying to get to like the big reveal up front, or are you trying to save that towards the end? Like, what is there kind of a pattern that seems to draw people in better than others?
This is going to sound like a cop out, but it depends on where or who I'm writing it for, placement wise. If it's something that is going to go, like the moment I'm done, it's going on our website, and I might, send it to Central for consideration, it probably gets to it pretty quickly. On the, at least 2 times a year, we have writing season for our departmental and college-wide magazine. And those can be a little more drawn out, like this led to this, which led to this, which led to this. If it's something that is going to go out almost immediately for general public consumption, I try to get to the quote meat up front and then explain why all that matters.
Yeah, the stuff that my office tends to publish deals a lot with awards that faculty have won, and if it's an impressive monetary amount, which is anything over $1 million, really, or a few million, then that's the lead, right? Then you get down into, okay, so what, why does this matter? And as Dave was saying, more of the process, right? If that also goes for if we have something to talk about in the arts or the humanities. There are several prestigious awards that have like absolutely no dollar amount. It's just like so-and-so got a fellowship. And really the only thing that makes them able to do that is that they get a buyout for their teaching, right? So it's not about the amount, it's about the sponsor, and like a National Endowment for Humanities. Those tend to be few and far between because it's not seen as a priority for the people working on our national budget, i.e. Congress. So those types of awards we write about, and they're really kind of the more cut and dry, with a little bit of the science communication sprinkled in. In my office, we also do like a graduate student spotlight. One of my team really kind of picked it up and made this her own. And something that we work on together is getting that lead that will pull people in. Graduate students don't get a whole lot of media attention. So to be able to talk about their research, not only may open the door to other mentors in their field, it helps them make connections at other universities. And really, it just starts to get their name out there so that when or if they decide to be a faculty member or a member of staff, scientific staff at like ORNL or Volkswagen or whatever, then they can cite that. They can say, well, look, here I was mentioned, this is kind of along the lines of what I do. And in those, we really do talk about the process. You know, Jen will ask the graduate student, like, how did you get into this? How did you get interested in this particular type of research? And a lot of the times it goes back to when they were kids. Like, I used to dig around in the dirt as a kid, and when I would find a bug that I had never seen before, I would ask so-and-so. I really like to learn how they navigated their particular ecosystem. And now I'm in earth and planetary sciences, or, oh gosh, I, I can't remember. But yeah, it's really neat to figure that process out.
And part of that too comes down to timeliness. Like if somebody gets, a big award from, say, the Defense Department, and it's something that the Defense Department's going to be sending a release on, the 10th, and everybody's expected to have something ready by then yeah, maybe you make more of the lead about the Defense Department and the award. But then later on, like, 6 months later, if we're featuring that person's work in our magazines, what we'll do is really tell the story of their research and what it is they're trying to accomplish and all that stuff. And then sort of near the end, will be like, oh, by the way, this also gained recognition and funding from the Defense Department to help with blah, 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 blah. Because by that point, it's not, the lead's not as much about the funding as it is the work. So it's kind of finding a balance. Like, why are you telling it when you're telling it? If it's something you're having to get out now, then it probably is because of the funding agency or the funding amount. If it's something you're telling because it's cool research, then that stuff's not nearly as big.
Yeah, which goes back to your audience and determining who they are. Yeah. And like Dave said, sometimes writing 2 stories to satisfy your different audiences, your more technical audience, and then your general public.
And like for us, just even within the audience that is engineering alumni, about, I guess, 2 years ago, we sent out a notice to every alumni that was, I think, under the age of 40. Said, if you wish to continue receiving the paper version, please fill this out and turn it back in. Otherwise, we're going to send you digital only. And, we got some, but most were fine getting the digital only, whereas the older alumni prefer getting the print piece. And so what can happen a lot of times is, if we're, like the magazines that just came out this past couple of weeks, we really started working on in January, February. So if it goes to print in early March and then something changes between March and April, the version that's online versus the version that's in the version that's online versus what's in the magazine can be completely different, because the online, by default, you can change whenever you need to. And the print is forever.
Yeah, so if you mess up, boy,
it's forever.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Any other questions?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate all the insight.
So how many people are on campus right now?
Oh, yeah.
No, this is my living room.
And this is mine.